September 19th, 1944. In 1347 hours, Hauptmann Ernst Barkmann stood in the turret of his Panzer AUSFG, binoculars pressed against his eyes, scanning the ridge line 1,200 meters northeast of Arracourt, France. Behind him, stretched across 3 kilometers of rolling farmland, sat the 42 operational tanks of Panzer Brigade 111. Panthers, Panzer Pfeffers, and a handful of Tigers pulled from reserve depots in Bavaria just 3 weeks earlier. Barkmann had fought through Russia, survived Kursk, and commanded a company at Normandy. He understood armoured warfare at an instinctive level: terrain, timing, the geometry of kill zones. His crews were veterans, men who could identify an enemy tank by engine sound alone, who could estimate range within 50 meters without optics. But standing in that turret on a clear autumn afternoon in Lorraine, watching the empty ridgeline shimmer in the heat, Barkmann felt something he'd never experienced in 4 years of combat. Not fear exactly, something closer to recognition. The sense that he was watching the final minutes of something ending. At 13:49 hours, American Sherman tanks began appearing over the ridge. Barkmann counted them out loud. 5, 10, 20, 30. The count continued. By the time his gunner asked permission to engage, Barkmann had counted 64 M4 Sherman tanks cresting the ridge in 3 staggered waves, turrets traversed forward, advancing at 15 kilometers per hour in textbook combat formation. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. 64 Shermans against his 42 German tanks. The arithmetic was simple. But arithmetic wasn't what made Barkmann's stomach tighten. It was what those 64 Shermans represented. Behind them, another 64, and behind those, 64 more, an endless procession of American industrial capacity rolling across French farmland in the form of 33-ton steel boxes produced at a rate of 2,000 per month. Barkmann had destroyed 11 Allied tanks in his career, 7 T-34s on the Eastern Front, 4 Shermans in Normandy. Each kill had required precise positioning, first-shot accuracy, immediate displacement. Each destroyed enemy tank had mattered because the enemy couldn't replace them quickly. That calculation had just become obsolete. To understand what happened in the next 120 seconds and why those 2 minutes represented more than a tactical defeat requires understanding what brought Panzer Brigade 111 to Arracourt in September 1944. More specifically, it requires understanding what Panzer Brigade 111 actually was beneath the impressive designation. On paper, the brigade was a formidable formation. Organized in late August 1944 as part of Germany's emergency response to the breakout from Normandy, the brigade was equipped with the latest Panther tanks, the Panzer AUSFG. With its 75mm KWK 42 L70 gun, could penetrate 138mm of armor at 1,000 meters. Its sloped 80mm frontal armor could defeat the Sherman's 75mm M3 gun at all but point-blank range. The crews were supposed to be veterans, pulled from existing formations, supplemented by instructors from training schools. The support elements, fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, repair units, were supposed to provide the brigade with 5 days of independent operational capability. That was the plan. The reality that arrived at Arracourt on September 18th was something different. Panzer Brigade 111 received its first tanks on August 29th. Production Fresh Panthers delivered directly from MAN's factory in Nuremberg, driven 400 kilometers to the assembly area near Metz. Of the 47 Panthers delivered, 6 broke down mostly during the transit. Final drive failures, transmission problems, engine fires. The Panther's Maybach HL-230 engine, designed to power a 45-ton tank, was now struggling to move a 48-ton vehicle after armor upgrades. The additional weight stressed every mechanical component. The crews arrived between September 2nd and September 7th. Barkmann's company, veterans from the 2nd Panzer Division, knew their equipment, but 2 of the brigade's 3 companies were staffed by a different kind of veteran. Panzer crewmen pulled from hospitals, men with 60% hearing loss from concussions, with hands scarred from burns, with eyes that tracked too slowly from blast trauma. and supplementing them, graduates from the abbreviated training program implemented in July 1944. Instead of 6 months of instruction, these crews received 8 weeks. Instead of 200 hours of live-fire exercises, they received 40. The brigade's commander, Oberst Hans-Joachim Kahler, conducted his first full-strength exercise on September 13th. The brigade would advance in column, deploy into line abreast formation, engage simulated enemy positions 2,000 meters distant, then conduct a tactical withdrawal. The exercise revealed catastrophic readiness problems: 17 Panthers through tracks during the deployment maneuver, 5 experienced transmission failures, 3 caught fire when their overworked engines ignited leaking hydraulic fluid. The radio net, which should have allowed seamless coordination between companies, was a chaos of missed transmissions, incorrect frequency assignments, and units that couldn't hear their own platoon leaders. Kahler filed a report requesting 4 weeks of additional training before deployment. The request was denied. Third Army, George Patton's armored spearhead, had advanced 600 kilometers in 3 weeks. They were approaching the Moselle River, the last natural barrier before the German border. Every available unit was needed to slow them down. On September 18th, Panzer Brigade 111 received movement orders. Objective: Arracourt, a small town 30 kilometers east of Nancy. Mission: counterattack. American forces restore the defensive line along the Moselle, prevent breakthrough to the Siegfried Line. Barkmann received the orders at his company command post near Château-Salins. He read them twice, then asked his operations officer if additional support units were being attached: artillery, infantry, reconnaissance. The operations officer confirmed. The brigade would attack alone. Air support was unavailable. Luftwaffe units in the region had fewer than 30 operational aircraft. Artillery was being conserved for defensive missions closer to the German border. Infantry divisions were still forming in rear areas. 42 tanks, no artillery, no air cover, no infantry. Against an American force estimated at division strength, approximately 10,000 men with full artillery support, complete air superiority, and unlimited logistics. Barkmann asked his gunner, a veteran named Klaus Richter, who'd served with him since Kursk, what he thought of the mission. Richter's response was succinct: "We're the fuel." The metaphor was precise. The brigade wasn't meant to win. It was meant to buy time, to force the Americans to deploy, to slow their advance for 24 hours, maybe 48. Long enough for engineer units to finish demolition work on the Metz fortifications, long enough for rear area logistics units to evacuate supply dumps. The Germans had a term for it: Verzögerungsgefecht, delaying action, a tactical concept that accepted local defeat to achieve strategic delay. The crews of Panzer Brigade 111 were being asked to fight an unwinnable battle so that other units elsewhere might have better chances. They moved out at 0200 hours on September 19th. The brigade covered 28 kilometers in 4 hours, an average speed of 7 kilometers per hour. Not because of American resistance, they encountered none, but because mechanical breakdowns forced the column to halt every 20 minutes. Another Panther threw a track, another's engine overheated, another's steering mechanism failed. Each breakdown required 15 to 30 minutes to repair or bypass. By 0900 hours, when the brigade reached its assembly area, 4 kilometers south of Arracourt, only 42 of the original 47 Panthers remained operational. Kahler established his command post in a stone farmhouse and convened his company commanders. The attack would launch at 1400 hours. Axis of advance: northeast toward Arracourt. Formation: 2 companies forward, 1 in reserve. Objective: penetrate American lines, destroy enemy armor, secure the town. Barkmann studied the map. The terrain favored the defense. Arracourt sat in a shallow valley. To reach it, German tanks would have to advance across 2 kilometers of open farmland, completely exposed to observation from the ridges on either side. Any American units positioned on those ridges would have perfect fields of fire. He raised this concern. Kahler acknowledged it, but explained that scouts had reported the ridges unoccupied. American forces were concentrated in Arracourt itself, preparing to continue their advance east. The scouts were wrong. Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division, Major General John Wood commanding, had positioned 2 battalion-sized task forces on the ridges northeast and northwest of the German assembly area. Task Force Abe, built around the 37th Tank Battalion, held the northeastern ridge with 64 M4A3 Sherman tanks. Task Force Hunter, 35th Tank Battalion, held the northwestern ridge with 53 Shermans. American scouts had spotted Panzer Brigade 111's movement at 30 hours. For the next 6 hours, while German tankers conducted maintenance and prepared for their attack, American forward observers radioed precise coordinates to divisional artillery. M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers, 105mm guns that could fire 20 rounds per minute, registered their ranging shots. The gunners calculated windage, elevation, charge weights. When the German attack began, they would be ready. The Americans also called in air support. At Nancy Airfield, 25 kilometers west, P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers from the 362nd Fighter Group fueled and armed their aircraft. Each Thunderbolt carried 8 5-inch HVAR rockets plus 6 500-pound bombs. Pilots received their briefings at 1200 hours. Target: German armor concentration near Arracourt. Time on target: 1400 hours. At 1347 hours, as Barkmann stood in his turret scanning the ridgeline, the Americans were watching him. Forward observers with spotting scopes tracked every German vehicle. Artillery batteries awaited fire orders. Fighter bombers circled at 3,000 meters altitude, invisible against the bright sky. And on the ridge, 1,200 meters away, 64 Sherman tanks sat hull down, only their turrets visible, main guns loaded, and traversed toward the German positions. Combat Command A's commander had deployed his forces using a tactical doctrine developed through 2 months of combat experience since the Normandy breakout. The doctrine was simple: never fight fair. Use terrain, use artillery, use air support. Let the Germans come to you, let them expose themselves, then destroy them with coordinated fires from multiple angles simultaneously. The Sherman tank, in direct one-on-one combat against a Panther, had a 23% chance of achieving a kill before being destroyed itself. Those odds were unacceptable, but a Sherman positioned hull down with artillery support and air cover, engaging an exposed Panther from 1,000 meters while 5 other Shermans fired on the same target, those odds approached 95%. This was the doctrine that had destroyed 3 panzer divisions in Normandy. It was about to destroy Panzer Brigade 111 at Arracourt. At 1349 hours, Barkmann watched the American Shermans crest the ridge. For 2 seconds, he considered the tactical situation. 64 enemy tanks at 1,200 meters, excellent firing position, hull down behind terrain, his own force exposed in open ground. No cover, except scattered trees that wouldn't stop a 75mm shell. His training, his 4 years of experience, his every instinct said the same thing. Withdraw. Immediately. Break contact before the Americans opened fire. Fall back to positions with better cover. Force the Americans to come to him. But his orders were explicit. Attack. Penetrate the American lines. Do not withdraw without authorization from brigade headquarters. At 1350 hours, Barkmann received the radio transmission from Kayla. All units, advance as planned. Engage enemy armor. No withdrawal. Barkmann acknowledged the order. He lowered himself into the turret, closed the hatch, and gave his driver the command. Forward, combat speed. His Panther's Maybach engine roared to 3,000 RPM. The 48-ton tank lurched forward, tracks churning the soft ground. Around him, 41 other German tanks began their advance. The next 120 seconds would determine everything. At 1350 hours and 23 seconds, the first American shell left its barrel. An M4A3 Sherman from B Company, 37th Tank Battalion, fired at a range of 1,280 meters. The 75mm M61 armor-piercing shell, traveling at 620 meters per second, covered the distance in 1.9 seconds. The shell struck a Panzer IV from the brigade's 2nd Company. Impact point: upper glacis plate, 17 degrees from perpendicular. The Panzer IV's 80mm frontal armor, angled at 10 degrees, was rated to defeat the M61 shell at ranges beyond 1,000 meters, but the shell hit a weld seam where two armor plates joined. The weld failed. The shell penetrated, entered the fighting compartment, and detonated the stored ammunition. The Panzer IV exploded, its turret separating from the hull in a column of fire. 3 seconds into the battle, Germany had lost its first tank. Over the next 8 seconds, 63 more Sherman tanks fired their first salvo, not all at once. That would have been wasteful. In sequence, platoon by platoon, target assignments coordinated by company commanders. Each Sherman gunner was assigned a specific German tank. No wasted shots on the same target. Barkmann saw the muzzle flashes ripple across the ridge like flashbulbs. He screamed into the radio for his company to disperse, to increase speed, to make themselves harder targets. But his transmission was drowned out by a dozen other voices, all shouting at once. Contact front. Tank hit. Brawn is burning. At 13:50 hours and 34 seconds, American artillery opened fire. 12 M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers, firing high-explosive shells with VT proximity fuses, detonated their rounds 10 meters above the German formation. Each 105mm shell scattered hundreds of steel fragments across a 50-meter radius. The fragments couldn't penetrate tank armor, but they could kill anyone exposed outside a vehicle. They could shred radio antennas. They could damage vision periscopes and optics. 3 German tank commanders, standing in their turrets for better visibility, were killed instantly. 5 Panthers lost their radio antennas, cutting them off from the command net. 7 tanks had their periscopes damaged, forcing gunners to rely on backup sites with limited fields of view. At 13:50 hours and 51 seconds, the P-47 Thunderbolts arrived. 16 aircraft, divided into 4 flights of 4, rolled into their attack runs from 3,000 meters altitude. The first flight targeted the rear of the German formation, where fuel trucks and ammunition carriers struggled to keep pace with the tanks. 8 rockets, each with a 45-pound warhead, destroyed 4 trucks and disabled 3 more. Secondary explosions followed as fuel tanks ruptured and ignited. Barkmann's Panther had covered 140 meters. He was still 1,060 meters from the American positions. His gunner identified a target, a Sherman partially exposed on the ridge. Richter fired. The Panther's 75mm gun recoiled. The shell covered the distance in under 2 seconds and struck the Sherman's turret at a glancing angle. The armor deflected the shell. It ricocheted away without penetrating. Richter reloaded. 7 seconds. He acquired the same target, adjusted his aim point lower, fired again. This time, the shell struck the Sherman's upper hull. Penetration. The American tank stopped moving, smoke pouring from its hatches. 1 Sherman destroyed, 63 remaining. At 13:51 hours and 18 seconds, 87 seconds into the battle, Barkmann's Panther took its first hit. A 75mm shell struck the right side of the turret, penetrated the 45mm side armor, and fragmented inside the fighting compartment. The shell's fragments killed the radio operator instantly and severed the intercom system. Barkmann could no longer communicate with his driver or gunner except by shouting over the engine noise. His gunner, Richter, was wounded. Fragments had torn through his left arm. But he remained at his position, traversing the turret, searching for targets. He fired again. Another Sherman hit, but not destroyed. The American tank reversed behind the ridge, disappearing from view. Barkmann checked his position. They'd advanced 280 meters, still 9 and 20 meters from the American line. Around him, the brigade was disintegrating. He counted 9 German tanks burning. 3 more were stopped, damaged, crews bailing out. The P-47s were making their second attack run, targeting the tanks themselves now. 1 Panther took a direct hit from a 500-pound bomb and ceased to exist, replaced by a crater and scattered debris. At 13:51 hours and 39 seconds, 98 seconds into the battle, Kayler's voice cut through the radio chaos. All units, withdraw, fall back to assembly area, execute immediately. But by then, withdrawal was impossible. The American artillery had shifted its fire pattern, now targeting the routes back to the German assembly area. The roads behind them were erupting in explosions. The P-47s were circling, waiting for any German tank that tried to retreat in the open. The brigade was trapped. Forward meant advancing into the concentrated fire of 62 Sherman tanks and 12 artillery pieces. Backward meant crossing a kill zone saturated with high explosive shells and fighter bombers. Staying in place meant remaining a stationary target. At 13:52 hours and 14 seconds, 113 seconds into the battle, Barkmann made his decision. He couldn't communicate with his driver over the destroyed intercom. He kicked the man's shoulder, pointed forward, gestured frantically. The driver understood. Maximum speed, straight at the American lines. It was a desperate tactic. If they could close the distance to 300 meters, they'd be inside the minimum effective range of the American artillery. The Shermans would have to adjust their positions, lose their hull-down advantage. It was a 5% chance, instead of a 0% chance. Barkmann's Panther accelerated to 46 kilometers per hour, its maximum speed. Richter continued firing, no longer aiming carefully, just loading and shooting as fast as possible, one round every 8 seconds. At 13:52 hours and 29 seconds, 128 seconds into the battle, 8 seconds before the 2-minute mark, Barkmann's Panther took its second hit. This time, an American shell struck the left track. The track shattered, wrapping around the drive sprocket. The Panther slewed violently to the left, then stopped, immobilized, 760 meters from the American positions. Through his damaged periscope, Barkmann could see 4 Sherman tanks traversing their turrets toward him. He had, perhaps, 5 seconds before they fired. He kicked his gunner, pointed at the closest Sherman, screamed, "Shoot!" Richter, blood-soaked but still functional, acquired the target and fired. The shell hit the Sherman's lower glacis plate and penetrated. The American tank began burning. 1 second later, 3 American shells converged on Barkmann's Panther. The first struck the turret face, penetrating the mantelet and killing the gunner. The second hit the side armor, setting the engine compartment on fire. The third struck the rear, detonating the fuel tanks. At 13:52 hours and 31 seconds, 130 seconds into the Battle of Arracourt, Hauptmann Ernst Barkmann's war ended. He pulled himself through the turret hatch, dropped to the ground, and ran. Behind him, his Panther burned. Around him, the farmland was dotted with dozens of other burning German tanks. The entire advance had covered less than 400 meters. The entire battle had lasted 130 seconds. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By 1400 hours, 10 minutes after the battle began, Panzer Brigade 111 had ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Of the 42 tanks that had advanced toward the American positions, 28 were burning. 8 more were immobilized with track or engine damage. 6 had managed to withdraw to the assembly area, but 3 of those were too damaged to continue fighting. The brigade's combat effectiveness, 7%. American losses, 11 Sherman tanks destroyed, 4 damaged. All 15 were replaced within 72 hours by vehicles driven directly from supply depots in Normandy, 400 kilometers away. German losses couldn't be replaced. The Panthers, destroyed at Arracourt, represented 3 weeks of total German tank production. The crews, the veterans like Barkmann and Richter, who had survived years of combat, were irreplaceable. Germany's training schools were already scraping the bottom of their instructor pools, sending men with 6 weeks of experience to teach recruits who would receive 8 weeks of training before deployment. But the numbers alone don't explain what happened at Arracourt in those 130 seconds. They don't explain why experienced German tankers, veterans of Kursk and Normandy, advanced across open ground into prepared American positions. They don't explain why the tactical situation that was obviously suicidal to Barkmann at 13:49 hours was nevertheless executed at 13:50 hours. To understand that requires understanding what Germany was trying to accomplish in September 1944, and more importantly, what Germany still believed was possible. On September 1st, 1944, Adolf Hitler convened a military conference at the Wolf's Lair, his headquarters in East Prussia. Present were Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the OKW, General Heinz Guderian, Inspector General of Panzer Troops, and Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments. The topic, tank production and deployment priorities. Guderian presented the situation on the Eastern Front. The Red Army had destroyed 28 German divisions in Operation Bagration during June and July. Soviet forces were now approaching the borders of East Prussia. To stabilize the front, Guderian requested all available panzer divisions be concentrated in the east. Speer presented production figures. German factories would produce approximately 350 Panther and Panzer IV tanks in September, another 280 in October. Total for the last 4 months of 1944, approximately 1,200 tanks. Hitler rejected Guderian's request. Instead, he ordered the creation of 10 new Panzer Brigades, each with 40 to 50 tanks. These brigades would be deployed to the Western Front, not the Eastern Front. Their mission: delay the American and British advance long enough for Germany to complete development of its new weapons. The V-2 rocket, the Me-262 jet fighter, the Type WWII U-boat. Guderian protested. 10 independent brigades scattered across the Western Front would be destroyed piecemeal. Better to concentrate the tanks into 3 or 4 full divisions that could conduct coordinated operations. Hitler overruled him. The decision was final. The new Panzer Brigades would deploy west. This decision, made in early September 1944, directly caused the destruction of Panzer Brigade 111 at Arracourt. On September 19th, the brigade was never meant to win a decisive battle. It was meant to exist, to force the Americans to stop and deploy, to consume time. The Germans called this strategy Zeitgewinn durch Raum, buying time through space. Every day the Allies spent fighting in France was one more day for German factories to produce jets and rockets, one more day for German engineers to complete the fortifications along the Siegfried Line, one more day to train new divisions from the latest conscription wave. The strategy had a certain logic. Germany couldn't win a war of industrial attrition against the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union combined. But perhaps Germany could delay long enough to deploy weapons so revolutionary that they would change the equation. Jet fighters that Allied piston engine aircraft couldn't intercept, rockets that no defense could stop, submarines that could sink Allied shipping faster than American shipyards could replace it. The strategy had one critical flaw. It required time, and time, in September 1944, was something Germany didn't have. Third Army, George Patton's armored spearhead, had advanced from the Normandy beaches to the Moselle River in 5 weeks. That's 600 kilometers at an average rate of 17 kilometers per day. At that pace, American forces would reach the Siegfried Line by mid-October, cross the Rhine by November, and enter Germany proper by December. The revolutionary weapons Hitler was waiting for wouldn't be ready until spring 1945 at the earliest. The Me-262 jet fighter was still experiencing engine reliability problems. The Type WWII U-boat hadn't completed sea trials. The V-2 rocket, while operational, was being produced at a rate of 300 per month, far too few to significantly impact Allied operations. Germany needed to buy 6 months. 6 months of delay on the Western Front, while the Eastern Front held and the weapons programs matured. Panzer Brigade 111 was one small part of that desperate calculation. Its 42 tanks, deployed at Arracourt, would force the Americans to halt their advance for perhaps 2 days, maybe 3, if the brigade fought well. Those 3 days, multiplied by 10 brigades deployed across the front, added up to weeks of delay, weeks that Germany desperately needed. But the calculation had a deeper flaw. It assumed that destroying German tanks would cost the Americans time. It assumed that American forces would need to pause, reorganize, replace losses before continuing their advance. That assumption was false. Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division destroyed Panzer Brigade 111 between 1350 and 1400 hours on September 19th. By 1500 hours, the same units had resumed their advance east. They didn't pause to count casualties. They didn't stop to repair damaged tanks. They simply left the damaged vehicles behind for recovery units, requested replacement tanks from division supply, and continued moving. By 1800 hours, on September 19th, Combat Command A had advanced another 12 kilometers east, capturing 2 villages and destroying an additional German strongpoint. Their Sherman losses from the morning battle, 11 tanks, had already been replaced by vehicles from the division's reserve pool. Crews whose tanks had been destroyed were assigned new tanks within 2 hours. The 3-day delay that Panzer Brigade 111 was supposed to buy lasted 5 hours. This pattern repeated across the Western Front. Throughout September 1944, Germany deployed its newly formed Panzer Brigades. American and British forces destroyed them in short, violent engagements, and then continued advancing within hours, as if the German counterattacks had been minor inconveniences rather than desperate last stands. The Americans lost more tanks in September 1944 than in any previous month of the war. 432 Sherman tanks destroyed, and yet American tank strength in Europe increased during the same period, from 3,147 operational tanks on September 1st to 4,103 operational tanks on September 30th. The mathematics was simple. American factories produced 2,020 Sherman tanks in September 1944. American shipping delivered 1,147 of those tanks to European ports. American logistics units transported 1,684 of those tanks from ports to frontline units. American forces lost 432 tanks in combat. Net change, plus 1,252 tanks. Germany produced 354 tanks in September 1944. German logistics units, crippled by fuel shortages and Allied air attacks, managed to deliver 287 of those tanks to frontline units. German forces lost 843 tanks in combat on both fronts. Net change, minus 556 tanks. The gap widened every month. By December 1944, American tank strength in Europe would reach 5,200 operational vehicles. German tank strength on the Western Front would decline to 1,270 operational vehicles, and of those, fewer than half had sufficient fuel for combat operations. Barkmann, crawling away from his burning Panther on the afternoon of September 19th, understood none of this in abstract terms. He didn't know the production figures. He didn't know that American factories were building 6 Sherman tanks for every Panther Germany produced. He didn't know that the United States had stockpiled 2,300 replacement tanks in Normandy specifically to maintain offensive momentum. But he understood the reality those numbers created. He understood that he'd just watched 42 German tanks destroyed in exchange for temporarily stopping an American force that would resume its advance within hours. He understood that there were no replacement tanks coming, no reinforcements, no second chance. He also understood that he'd survived. Again, Barkmann reached the German assembly area at 16:20 hours, 4 hours after his Panther had been destroyed. He'd walked most of the way, hitching a brief ride on a half-track that was evacuating. Wounded. At the assembly area, he found chaos. The brigade's rear elements, supply trucks, maintenance vehicles, command posts were preparing to withdraw east. The 6 surviving tanks were being loaded with as much fuel and ammunition as they could carry. Kahler, the brigade commander, was sitting in his command vehicle, writing a report. Barkmann reported to him. Kahler looked up, saw Barkmann's burned uniform and smoke-stained face, and asked a single question. "How many tanks in your company?" "None operational, Herr Oberst. All destroyed or immobilized." Kahler nodded and returned to his report. He didn't ask about casualties. He didn't ask what happened. The answers were obvious from the smoke rising from the battlefield 4 kilometers away. That night, Barkmann sat with the surviving crews from his company. 8 men out of 25. They didn't discuss the battle. There was nothing to discuss. They'd been ordered to attack. They'd attacked. They'd been destroyed. That was the entire story. One of the survivors, a loader named Friedrich Haas, asked the question everyone was thinking. "What happens now?" Barkmann didn't have an answer. The brigade no longer existed. Most of its tanks were destroyed. Most of its crews were dead or captured. In a rational military system, the survivors would be reassigned to other units. They'd receive new tanks, new crews, additional training. But Germany in September 1944 wasn't operating under a rational military system. It was operating under an increasingly desperate system that created formations like Panzer Brigade 111, threw them into unwinnable battles, and then created new formations from the survivors to repeat the process. 3 days later, on September 22nd, Barkmann received new orders. He was being assigned to Panzer Brigade 113, a formation created in early September with the same organization as Brigade 111. Brigade 113 had just arrived in Lorraine with 38 Panthers. It would deploy near Arracourt on September 25th. Barkmann understood what that meant. He'd watch the same battle again. Different date, different tanks, same outcome. Between September 19th and September 29th, 1944, American and German forces fought a series of engagements around Arracourt that military historians later designated the Battle of Arracourt. The battle involved multiple German counterattacks using the newly formed Panzer Brigades. Each attack followed the same pattern: advance across open terrain, encounter prepared American positions, suffer catastrophic losses, withdraw. German forces committed approximately 262 tanks to the battle over 10 days. American forces destroyed or disabled 200 of them. American losses: 48 Sherman tanks destroyed, 39 damaged. The kill ratio was 4.2 to 1 in favor of the Americans. This ratio was unprecedented. During the Normandy campaign, the kill ratio had been roughly 1.3 to 1 in favor of the Germans. At Arracourt, it reversed and multiplied. The reasons were tactical, but reflected deeper strategic realities. First, American forces fought from prepared defensive positions. They used terrain. They positioned their tanks hull down behind ridges, minimizing exposure. The Germans, ordered to attack regardless of circumstances, advanced across open ground. Second, American forces had complete artillery superiority. They deployed 12 artillery battalions in support of the 4th Armored Division, approximately 144 guns. Each battalion could fire 240 rounds per minute, sustained. The Germans had 3 artillery battalions in the sector, approximately 36 guns, with ammunition rationed to 20 rounds per gun per day due to supply shortages. Third, American forces had absolute air superiority. P-47 Thunderbolts flew 342 sorties over Arracourt between September 19th and September 29th. The Luftwaffe flew 7 sorties during the same period, all reconnaissance flights. No German fighter bombers appeared. But the most significant factor was logistics. American tank units that lost vehicles in combat received replacements within 24 to 72 hours. German units that lost tanks received nothing. On September 27th, 8 days into the Battle of Arracourt, Combat Commander A reported to 4th Armored Division headquarters that it had 91 operational Sherman tanks. This was 2 fewer than its authorized strength of 93 tanks. Despite having lost 26 tanks in combat over the previous 8 days, the unit was at 98% strength. On the same day, Panzer Brigade 113, which had deployed with 38 tanks on September 25th, reported 11 operational tanks remaining. The brigade had been destroyed in 48 hours. The Battle of Arracourt ended on September 29th, when German forces withdrew to defensive positions 15 kilometers east. The Americans didn't pursue aggressively. They didn't need to. The German counterattacks had failed completely. The road to the Siegfried Line was open. Barkmann survived the Battle of Arracourt. His 2nd Panther, assigned when he joined Brigade 113, was destroyed on September 27th by American artillery. He escaped again, this time with a fractured wrist from being thrown against the turret interior during the hit. He was evacuated to a field hospital, treated, and released for duty on October 4th. By then, there were no Panzer brigades left to join. All 10 brigades created in late August and early September had been destroyed. Total German tank losses from the 10 brigades, approximately 420 tanks. Total time bought by their deployment, 11 days. American forces reached the Siegfried Line on October 2nd, 1944. They'd been delayed, not by German counterattacks, but by fuel shortages in their own logistics system. Patton's Third Army had advanced so far, so fast, that American supply trucks couldn't keep up. The delays caused by German resistance were measured in hours. The delays caused by American logistics were measured in weeks. The revolutionary weapons Hitler was buying time for never materialized in sufficient quantities. The Me-262 jet fighter entered combat in November 1944, but only 200 were operational by war's end. Engine reliability remained poor. Pilot training was inadequate. The Type 21 U-boat never saw combat. The V-2 rocket killed approximately 9,000 people in London and Antwerp, but had zero impact on military operations. Germany's strategy of trading space for time failed because the space was consumed faster than expected, and the time bought wasn't enough to matter. On April 9, 1945, 7 months after Arracourt, Barkmann was captured by American forces near Hanover. He spent 2 years in a prisoner of war camp in England, was released in 1947, returned to Germany, and lived until 1947. He died at age 79, having survived one of the most lethal occupations of the 20th century. In post-war interviews conducted in 1978 by military historians researching armored warfare, Barkmann was asked about Arracourt. Specifically, he was asked about the moment at 13:49 hours when he counted 64 Sherman tanks cresting the ridge and knew what was coming next. His answer was recorded. "I counted them and I understood. Not just that we would lose that battle, that we had already lost the war. They had 64 tanks on that ridge, and I knew behind them was 64 more, and behind those, 64 more again. We couldn't destroy them fast enough. They couldn't replace us at all. The mathematics were very simple. I just hadn't seen them so clearly before." The interviewer asked what he meant by the mathematics. Barkmann clarified, America was producing 8,000 Sherman tanks per year. Germany was producing 4,000 Panthers and Panzer IVs combined. America had 3 fronts, the Pacific, Italy, and France. Germany had 2 fronts, Russia and France. America could lose 2 tanks for every one we destroyed and still increase their strength. We couldn't lose even 1 tank for every 2 we destroyed and maintain ours. Over time, over months, the only possible outcome was that they would have tanks and we wouldn't. That's what I saw at Arracourt. Not a battle. The conclusion of an equation that had been calculated in factories months earlier. The Battle of Arracourt was a small engagement in the context of World War II. It involved fewer than 500 tanks total. It lasted 10 days. It didn't feature the dramatic turning points of Stalingrad or the scale of Kursk or the strategic significance of D-Day, but it demonstrated, with mathematical precision, the central reality of industrial warfare. Wars aren't won by superior tactics or better weapons or more skilled soldiers. They're won by the side that can produce more weapons faster, deploy them more efficiently, and sustain losses longer. In September 1944, the United States produced 2,020 Sherman tanks, 11,100 aircraft, 394,000 trucks, and 657,000 tons of ammunition. Germany produced 354 tanks, 3,013 aircraft, 7,200 trucks, and 89,000 tons of ammunition. The ratios: 5.7 to 1 in tanks, 3.7 to 1 in aircraft, 55 to 1 in trucks, 7.4 to 1 in ammunition. Those ratios created the situation at Arracourt where 64 Sherman tanks could appear over a ridge, destroy an entire Panzer Brigade in 130 seconds, and then continue their advance within 5 hours as if nothing significant had occurred. Barkmann's last 120 seconds as a Panzer commander, watching those 64 Shermans crest the ridge, weren't significant because of what happened in those 120 seconds. They were significant because of what those 120 seconds represented, the moment when industrial reality became impossible to deny, even for a veteran who'd spent 4 years believing that skill and courage could overcome material disadvantage. The Panther was technically superior to the Sherman in almost every measurable way, but America built 49,134 Sherman tanks during World War II. Germany built 6,042 Panthers. The Americans could lose 8 Shermans for every Panther destroyed and still come out ahead. At Arracourt, the exchange ratio was only 4.2 to 1. The Americans didn't need to achieve parity. They just needed to keep advancing, and they did. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.